My next guest in the program is Liberal MP Andrew Laming, joining us via, his home setup, as a lot of people are doing right now. Thanks very much for your time, Andrew. A lot of debate today around casuals, and Labor points out you might have people that have been in a job for 10 months with one employer. Why should they be detached from that employer and not be eligible just because of this arbitrary 12-month deadline? What's your response to that?
Well, clearly we do have around 900,000 casuals out of the 2.5 million that haven't been with their employer for a year, and this is an emergency piece of legislation. We're simply not going to have the opportunity to finesse to this degree arrangements for shorter-term workers. Keeping in mind, though, that part-time workers are going to be paid the full $1,500 amount, that we're trying to do this in time for May 1, and finally that subsequent changes, first of all, have limited discretion through the Commissioner themselves, but very limited, and secondly, that there may be some options through either delegated authority or a disallowable instrument to make changes down the track, possibly for subsequent months, but certainly not for May, given the short time frame.
Right, but given all of that, I mean, you say there's a difficulty in when you can roll this out. If you just changed that amount of time you had to be with an employer from 12 months to 6, for example, why couldn't that happen with a stroke of the pen, and why would that be a bad idea?
And that's quite right. We obviously know that providing discretion around the 30% drop in turnover is an issue, because the minute you give a bit of discretion, you lose a mile. But certainly with tenure and how long a company's been around, well, the ATO knows that. They know exactly when companies set up, and there's a small subset of them. There's about 600 in every electorate in Australia that are employing and have been around less than 12 months. So it's really up to the ATO to go to that next level of granularity. You saw that they were told that they would set up compassionate access to super and it would take a month. They've now pulled that back and provided it last Monday. So the ATO is stepping up. And for them to step up there for companies that have been around less than 12 months, they're going to have to, again, identify the subset and then apply the discretion, which is we'll look at your first 3 or 6 months, and if you can prove that 30% drop, you may become eligible after the full 12-month period has expired. So there could be businesses that set up last May that become eligible in May, but unless it's done through discretion or there is something like a disallowable instrument down the track, that won't be happening at the moment. The only other option really for government is single touch payroll, which of course provides both the company's details, how much wage they pay, how much tax they withhold, and the tax file numbers of every employee. I mean, there's some remote possibility there that we can infer number of employees, and certainly if you're only claiming 2 JobKeeper payments and you're paying $1,000 a fortnight, it's self-evident there's at least 3 other employees in the business, but we don't know hours worked through single touch payroll, so these would be increasingly less precise, but they represent an option if sub-parties want to talk about it after May of this year.
Well, OK, so let's just run through. You're advocating then that if there's, in particular, a company that has only been going on at less than 12 months, that employees would be eligible. Is this what you're saying should happen, or you think this would happen through the government's process anyway if the ATO decides to go down that path? What specifically are you saying? So
there's very limited discretion for the Tax Commissioner at the moment, and obviously you can see why. If you give a bit of discretion around 30%, then of course the whole system falls apart. But I am arguing that over tenure or duration of being in business, there's really no slippery slope here. The Commissioner just needs the powers to be a little bit more understanding that a business like a pizza restaurant that's set up in April last year, that employs 20 casuals, will eventually be 12 months and will have the appropriate tenure next month. Can the Commissioner have the discretion? And that's the key question, whether that's built in to legislation. I mean, that one doesn't run out of control when you give a little bit, because it simply allows other businesses in a similar circumstance with casuals will otherwise be in the welfare system having a chance to be JobKeeper remunerated.
So this is an element in the legislation in terms of that specific discretion that you want included. Have you spoken to the Minister, Christian Porter? Is this going to be in the bill or not?
Look, we know there's limited discretion for the Commissioner. The question is, will it revolve around purely the 30% or also company duration? At this stage, my hunch is that it won't. And so you're then left with the next option, which is what can be done through disallowable instruments down the track, which obviously, once they're placed on the table, they would effectively come into force after a particular period of time. But of course, the Parliament isn't meeting to consider these either. So these become very, very unpredictable pathways. As I've said, what does the ATO have? At the moment, they do have single touch payroll. They can see what's being paid. They can't see the hours worked, and that is the problem with us not being able to pick up casual workers at this point, unless you make inferences about how much is being both paid and retained in tax, and then pay JobKeeper accordingly. At the moment, that isn't the possibility. It's not the case.
All right, well, we'll see what happens by Wednesday. Possibly the Minister might be watching and see if he wants to pick up the idea. Just wanted to ask quickly as well, of course, as a doctor yourself, what have you made of the Ruby Princess ship? Why, I guess, at this stage, if there are accusations from Peter Dutton that people on the ship lied, given the importance right then of avoiding coronavirus spreading through Australia, why was the word of mouth or the word taken from the ship? Why would Australian authorities not have said we're going to do some pretty strong testing when they get off, including temperature testing and so on? Wouldn't that have been a better idea given what was at stake?
There's no idea in retrospect. We can think of ways of doing this better, and it's ended up being an absolute disaster, the management of that entire episode. But, Tom, as we look at the data now, we are seeing that some of these early steps that were taken, which have led to large numbers of infections, are actually now coming to the end of that 20-day clinical course. So we're seeing an uptick in mortality rates in Australia, but I want to point out they are still world leading, equalled only by Japan and possibly Chile for the lowest death rates in the world. What we will now see is a significant jump, as Victoria is openly reporting, in recovered cases. 40% of their cases have recovered. New South Wales, Queensland are not reporting with the same fervour, meaning that we're still focused on total cases but not realising that nearly half of them are already home. So at the moment in Queensland, where we only saw 7 cases yesterday, and that's a bit of a blip, what I'm saying is that there's about that many recovering, but within a week there'll be around 40 cases a day recovering in Queensland, and we'll see for the first time potentially a fall in active cases, and that's the number that I know public health officials will be watching very closely, particularly over the Easter break. If people can't stay home over Easter, that's an issue.
There are a lot of good signs. I think right now a lot of the measures that Australian government eventually took do look like they're having a positive impact. We're hoping so. But just on this ship, you mentioned, things you could do in retrospect. This wasn't just retrospect, was it? Wouldn't that have been a common sense approach at that time, with the government saying, well, this is what the ship said? I thought this was a tough on borders government that would say, this is going to endanger Australian lives, we're going to take this action. Surely that was foreseeable.
Yes, that's right. So you just have to, I think this will all be looked at down the track, weaving through this tragedy, identifying who was in charge of disembarkation and who was making the orders around community health. So there's no doubt you can see that there's failures here. No one's denying that, I don't think. But I'm also pointing out that after this initial bolus of infections around aged care facilities, cruise liners and international arrivals, Australia's doing an extraordinary job in retaining control over domestic and terrestrial transmission between people that never travelled. And you can see the Chief Health Officer in Queensland identifying that out of our nearly 1,000 cases, there's 32 that we don't fully understand. And it's wonderful that she can get down to that small number and ask for more testing in particular hotspots to get on top of it. It's a credit that Australia's on top of this. Queensland leads the way of the big states, but New South Wales is bending this curve as well. So increasingly, watch for those increases in recovered cases, a fall in active cases. It's not going to go away, Tom. This will be here for the whole flu season. It's a matter of when we are confident that we're not going to see an overwhelmed health system. It's after that point that we can have conversations about policy changes, and not before. Mark my words, Easter and the 10 days after Easter are critical to see if Australians can follow these restrictions to the letter so that we keep on top of this.
All right, interesting element there, that Easter and just after that period, so that's not far away. So it's probably feeling difficult right now for people. It's sort of kicking in this isolation, but important to keep it up, Andrew Laming. We might keep talking to you during this crisis. As you say, it could go for some time. We'll see when we might be able to lift the handbrake. Thank you.